All right. Super. Thank you guys for having me back. I'm very excited to be here tonight, talk to you about a project that we haven't actually done. I don't know if we've done very many presentations about the Indiangrass project, Preserve project, but it's a really fascinating project. A lot of you guys probably know us from kind of the work that we're doing in town, which is an important component, but we all know that like real biodiversity on a scale is going to be done in these rural contexts with unfragmented landscapes. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to restore actually it's a 53 acre chunk. 2 of those acres of the 55 is actually a trail. But what we're trying to do is something similar to, how many of you guys have been to the Indiangrass Preserve before? So quite a few of you guys. How many of you have been out there since 2014? So fewer of you. How many of you guys have been to Sheldon Lake? Yeah, most of you guys. So the prairie reconstruction that happened at Sheldon Lake is kind of what we based this reconstruction off of. In fact, for you guys who know Andy Sippetz, very talented habitat biologist here with Texas Parks and Wildlife, we actually got Andy to come out, take a look at our situation, talk about the feasibility of the restoration, talk about his work at Sheldon, which we are familiar with, and help talk us through what that looked like. So as Andy would tell you, you don't ever know what you got until you start. And so we started this project, and let me just go ahead and clarify real quickly the difference between a restoration and a reconstruction, because we use both terms. A restoration, broadly, is just when you have a prairie that is in okay or a little bit degraded context, but you have a lot of things that you want to save in there. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to use the tools in the toolbox to get it up to a higher state. A reconstruction happens when you're starting from the studs, okay? So if any of you guys have seen Shasta Prairie at U of H or MD Anderson Prairie, those were started from bare dirt, nothing. So those are kind of reconstructions. This kind of reconstruction work, though, is based more on historical precedents because we used aerial photography from the 1930s to help us decide where the wetlands should be. And we used a lot of exploratory digging working with SWCA. So one of the main points that I'm going to have in here is this is not just the work of KPC. It is the work of an army of people to put together. It's very easy to destroy a prairie of that size with a bulldozer. You can have people who are just skilled in using a bulldozer go in and destroy a 55 acre tract pretty quickly. It's very difficult to put it back together in any semblance of order. And so in order to do that, these are just some of the groups that helped on this project. This is not everybody. I didn't capture everybody. In fact, I don't think I put SWA and SWCA on here. But these are just some of the groups that helped either bring engineering talent, seed talent, restoration talent, volunteer talent. Talk louder. Okay, I don't have a problem with that. Or consulting. So these large prairie reconstructions that you see at Sheldon Lake, at the Katy Prairie, it really is not one group can't handle that unless they had a massive team of folks, okay? So that's one thing. And obviously, I'm going to thank our supporters real quick because this was about a $600,000 project for 55 acres because we put in a 1.7 acre trail as well as this restoration of this historic prairie wetlands complex. So here's a key point. A lot of times when you're doing these projects, there are crossroads and decision points, inflection points. You need to make a decision. I'm going to go this way, or am I going to go that way? One thing that we could have done for much, much cheaper is we could have taken that 55 acres as flat as it was, devoid of its historical wetlands, and restored that at a much cheaper rate. So in order to put a trail, or actually to do it that way, it would have probably been about $500 per acre on average, probably about $800 when you factor in all the uncertainty that's happened over the last few years. In order to do it this way that I'm going to show you tonight, it costs about $10,000 an acre to restore. Okay, so this is kind of like the Cadillac version of reconstruction, but I can already tell you that it's going to yield in the next few years things that a flat restoration without restoring any of the hydrology, it's going to yield benefits, and already yielded benefits that something like that can't touch. So Different contexts call for different things. Different budgets call for different decisions. So one of the things as we go along the way is I might say some things where you go, I'm not comfortable with that. I don't like that decision. Why did you do that? That's okay. This is as much craftsmanship as it is science at this point. And so one of the things that we always say is that we're wedded to success and we're going to listen to everybody. So we use a variety of pathways to get where we want to be. We try to be as holistic in our thinking as possible. And I'll get to those points and then I'll ask you some questions. All right. So one of the key things, whenever you're doing something like this, is you need to ask, why are you doing it in the first place? The why is critical. Any project that does not answer the why should not proceed anywhere in life. You got to answer the why to get to the how to get to the what. And a lot of times we want to get to the what real fast. But that's not really the way that these projects should work. Because if you don't get the why, then you oftentimes lose people. So oftentimes when we're doing projects, either on the Katy Prairie and especially in the city, that why has to be crystal clear. Point in fact, we're putting a pocket prairie on the University of St. Thomas campus this Earth Day, this Saturday. First time that a pocket prairie in that neighborhood in Montrose is going to be there in goodness knows how long, 60s or whatever, right? Awesome. But the why has to be super, super clear because it looks like a patch of weeds. So the why for doing it, in their case, is deeply embedded in their religious faith. Their why has to be right for them and their community. So that goes to interpretive part, the third piece. So what's the story you're trying to tell? Will people connect with that story? And if people connect with that story, will they maybe turn from adversary to advocate? Okay? So that why, that storytelling part, it's got to be sharp. The other pieces also have to be sharp. How are you going to get humans to connect with that project, both as volunteers and as supporters, hopefully? That's the human connectivity part, and through education. And then from a scientific standpoint, what are you hoping to achieve? If you want to grow deer, you'll plant a certain collection of plants. And it may not pay attention to the pollinators or the other creatures. If you want to really grow a whole bunch of quail, you might use a different selection of species. If you're going for biodiversity in its largest sense, then that's going to inform what seeds you use, what plants you use, where you get the genetics, all that stuff. So the ecological goals are very important too. For this project, we were shooting for max diversity. That's what we were shooting for. We weren't shooting to bring back a specific species. We were really looking forward to bring as many of those prairie species back as possible as a groundwork for improving the wildlife habitat. And then the ecosystem services. And what I mean by that is, depending on the types of grasses and plants that you're using, it could affect how much carbon is sequestered or how much water is absorbed. So in this case, we're going to go for a lot of water absorption. One of the main components of the Katy Prairie of our story is that we're a people-oriented group. We don't just care about the wildlife and the plants, we care about them dearly. But we love people. So we want to help protect people downstream. So what we want to do is we want to make our landscapes as spongy as possible. And when you're talking spongy, you're talking tall grasses. Fortunately, the Katy Prairie, we think, was about 65 to 70% tall grasses by biomass originally. So we planted a lot, and that influenced what grasses we grew and at what percentage versus wildflowers. In the city, sometimes that's flipped around. They're not comfortable with that many grasses, right? So sometimes we actually flip the ratio. Do 60% wildflowers and fewer grasses, and sometimes we don't even do the tallest grasses. Little bluestem may be the tallest grass. So all of these things go into, and a lot more go into, including budgets and things like that, go into decisions that are made. So when we're thinking about what to do, we have to be thinking about context. Context is always the most critical thing. What are your soils telling you? What is your community telling you? What is your budget telling you could do? Because sometimes we work on the Katy Prairie Preserve, but sometimes we work at all these different sites. These are all of our prairie builder schools and park sites. So we work with partners in the city, and we have to match up with their value systems. So we got to tell their stories to their communities, but we also have to work with their mission and their goal. So they want to bring back monarch butterflies. You know, we might probably throw in some more milkweed than we usually would, but we'll also make sure to have a lot of pollinator plants. Okay? If they want to do something else, we might take a different tack. So sometimes it's about biological diversity. This is the Gulf fritillary on a purple-headed sneezeweed. Sometimes it's about teaching. We want to spread that prairie fire throughout the city, which it very much is spreading, which is great. Sometimes it's about ecological services, right? So even a patch like MD Anderson Prairie is doing all of this stuff. It's about having more sustainable landscapes. Sometimes, and this doesn't really show up well, this is a field of wildflowers in the medical center. Sometimes it's just about beauty. Sometimes just putting beauty in the world is a good enough reason to do a project. But we're going to focus in on the Indiangrass Preserve, which is part of the Katy Prairie Preserve. So the Katy Prairie Preserve, for you guys who don't know much about what we are, is we're a land trust, which means that we save land. That's our main job. That's what we get up every day to try to do. It's very expensive. In fact, we got over $1 million payment coming up in less than a month. So if you have any loose change in your sofas or whatever, just let us know. But since 1992, this is our 25th anniversary at KPC. And since 1992, we have helped to conserve over 21,000 acres. You can fit all of Manhattan Island and 2 memorial parks on that acreage. So that's one part of the puzzle. What is the potential for restoration on this property? Well, it's pretty darn high because it's still surrounded by agricultural and wild lands. So if I had a 53-acre patch in the middle of the city, so Deer Park Prairie is 50 acres, right? But completely encircled. Well, that's a completely different dynamic. There are certain things that just are not going to, we're not going to get, cougars on there anytime soon. We still have them out on the Katy Prairie because of connectivity. Okay, we're not going to have bald eagles probably hunting Deer Park Prairie, even though floristically it is off the charts, right? So we have the advantage of being highly connected to other landscapes. So a lot of times when people go into this whole prairie restoration, prairie reconstruction thing, this is what they want to end up with. So how many of you guys dug plants out of the Psalms Road Prairie back in the day? So there's some diehards here who went out in August of 2008 and dug out as many plants as they could. We saved about 25,000 square feet of plants. Put them at over 30 different sites across but you can't reconstruct this. This is not reconstructible. The way that I talk to people about what to try to save here and the discernment process, as I said, is like going into a museum you knew they were going to burn down the next day and you wanted to save 2 or 3 pieces of artwork. So what are you going to save? So we did that as best as we could. But you can't get back to this. But here's the thing. Sometimes people let that stop them and they say, well, we can't get to over 300 species and all the hydrological and dynamic soils and all that stuff, so don't even try. It's never going to happen in your lifetime. Well, I don't agree with that at all. Because I know that a pretty flat, barren stretch of Bahia grass or King Ranch bluestem is pretty much a biological, it's not a desert because deserts are alive, it is a wasteland, okay? And anything that we can do to improve wastelands anywhere, from a lawn to a pasture that's not diverse to a tiny tallow forest, is a good thing. And I'll show you a little bit about that. So another thing that people say is the goal of our restoration should be to get back to pre-Columbian conditions. We should try to set this landscape back to the year 1491 before Columbus got here. The problem with that is we have no idea what it was like in 1491 because we don't have any botanical records. And I'll tell you the honest to goodness truth is the human habitation in this area is very complicated. And the effects of humans in this area is very complicated. So by the time many of the botanists who got here in the 1800s were surveying plant communities, the whole prairie community had started to change because of feral cattle and feral horses, the elimination of many Native Americans through disease, who were the caretakers of the prairie. Human dynamics and European influences had already started to take hold. So don't use that as a marker. We used to use that as a marker a lot. We don't use that anymore. We're looking for functionality. How does it function for something? Does it function for wildlife, carbon sequestration, water, that kind of thing? And oftentimes the best way to get there doesn't mean that we change our philosophy. Our philosophy is go for max diversity because those are the food webs that create stability, resilience, and also great wildlife habitat. So we can't get to this, but we can get to something really, really nice. So that's one thing to consider. The main idea is here's our Visitor center is using the word very, very generously. This is our field office. And this, if you can barely see it, but it's a gridded block, right? So there are grid lines in it. Well, those are kind of like, this was a research center. That building was not meant for a visitor center because it has definitely not got any creature comforts in it. This was a place to test herbicides and fungicides, okay? And by a succession of companies. So all of a sudden, you got several things going on. By the time we got the property, not only had they been testing those chemicals for years, so we needed to check the soil, and fortunately it checked out okay, but they had leveled the whole thing to a great precision. So all the historic potholes that were there were gone. They were all flat. Secondly, because they had such a history of using fungicides and herbicides, the plant community was not diverse. In fact, the plant community was not diverse. It was very not diverse. So if you go out there, maybe on average throughout the year, if you're not just little things, like if you can find a species, that doesn't mean that it's really there. It's not, what I'm saying is, it's not abundant. So if you're talking about the common species on a piece of property, you're talking maybe 15 or 20 species, not high diversity. This is one of the species that we're still battling, but was very, very present. This is a rye from Europe. And for the most part, it was kind of it wasn't a monoculture of bad invasive grasses, but it was pretty close, pretty close. So we weren't inheriting very good plant community or hydrology. What we were inheriting, for the most part, was good soil and potential. That's what we were inheriting. So this started off there, because that's exactly where we started off. And this is, super flat, okay? So one of the first things we decided was we needed to bring back some of the original hydrology. Well, how do you do that? And how do you know how the hydrology flowed? Because they flattened out the thing, they dug canals, they rerouted water, all that stuff. Well, fortunately, there are a couple of clues as to what was going on with this property. First of all, this is a great map. I use this a lot. If you want to know land use change in this area, study this map. This tells you exactly where some of the crops that we grew. Okay? So you can see the rice belt over there on the Katy Prairie, and cotton to the southwest of us, and melons up in Hempstead, and figs and sugarcane and things like that. So first thing that we knew was that before it was a herbicide and fungicide center, it was a rice farm. And so it was very likely that even before they flattened it completely to do this agricultural research, that it had potholes that had over time also been filled in for rice farming. And what they would do typically in this area is they would take the high spots, the pimple mounds, and throw them into the potholes to level things out. So you got a very different soil type here, and you throw them into this wetland, and you'd flatten the whole thing out and kind of mix it up a little bit. So we knew that that was probably going on here. So what we needed to do is we needed to find the wetland soils. Because once we started drilling down and we hit wetland soils, we knew that that was probably used to be a wetland down there. And we'd dig around and do exploratory digging, and then once we stopped hitting the wetland soil, guess what? You're out of the pothole. You're out of that old pothole. But we didn't want to do random digging, right? So we did what Andy Sippets and other folks have done. What we did is we knew that there's historical imagery for the area that shows you where the potholes were. Now, if you download Google Earth Pro, and sorry this is so dark, but if you download Google Earth Pro, you can go back to 1944 in Harris County. Unfortunately, we're in Waller County, just right outside. And there's no historical imagery on Google Earth Pro. But there were a series of 1931 aerial photographs from across the state that you could purchase. And so we bought those. But if you take a look at the Katy Prairie right now, and you can see there's cypress right there, and here's the Highway 99 going through. That's what it looks like now. But in 1944, that's what it looked like. All of those dark stains are potholes. So one of the things that we needed to know for a prairie reconstruction on the Katy Prairie is it would not be authentic if it were all upland prairie. That much of the prairie, 40%, 35% in some places, was wetland, a prairie wetland that was embedded within this upland prairie. And it was a complex. It was a prairie wetland complex. It's all a unit, right? And then cut through by these beautiful, sinuous, kind of wooded corridors. And when I think of the historic Katy Prairie, this is what I think of. It's the whole complex of wetlands, prairie, wooded corridor, all together as a major ecosystem type. So we needed to reintroduce those potholes. So we got busy, we got those 1931 aerial photographs, and we noticed that that's where they were. So the overlay that you see is some of the engineering schematics. So what we tried to do was two things. One is, you might notice that these potholes kind of line up on this kind of trajectory going this way. And that was revealed is the original hydraulic flow didn't, as it does now, kind of carry water that way to a ditch and around the property. It kind of cut through the property. So one of the things that we had to decide was, well, where's that water going to flow? And we wanted to kind of get the original flow. So we needed to engineer that situation a little bit. So what you will see if you go out to the Indiangrass Preserve now is that we have reconstructed potholes, and in between the potholes we have fallout pipes that carry the water from pothole to pothole in a stepwise fashion in descending elevation and out to a little stream. So that kind of carries the water over the property and through the property. Now, what that also does, right, and Andy, you know this back there, is it carries a lot of seeds and invasive species and things. So we know that there is a potential cost there. But we wanted to reintroduce not just the wetlands, the transient wetlands that will dry up, but we also wanted to bring back the water flow. So we worked with a number of companies to do just that. So they did exploratory digging, SWCA did, and then we delineated where the potholes were. And then what are you going to do? You can't use volunteers to dig them out. It's just a little bit too much work, and we like our volunteers. So what we did was, like we said, we brought in Andy Sippets. He gave us his learned by the hard way lessons of using heavy equipment to move land. One of the things that we could not do is puncture the clay layer. One of the reasons that the Katy Prairie was one of the best rice growing regions on planet Earth was it had really fertile soil sitting on top of a thick clay layer that held in water. Okay? That's why it's called the Katy Prairie, because that Katy Prairie is sitting on a soil association that does just that. So if you puncture that clay layer, it will leak out, the water will leak out. And so there's a project that happened down south of us where they punctured the clay layer and then had to reline the whole pond because it was very expensive, because it lost the water. So we didn't want to do that. So he said, first rule is make sure to be on site when these people are moving with heavy equipment. Make sure they do not puncture that clay layer, and don't go any deeper than about 24 inches, because that's about as deep as the potholes get around here. So aim for about 14 to 24 inches. Okay, so do that. So we worked with this hydrological engineer named Jerry Ince, very talented. And so what he tried to do was a little bit of magic. What he tried to do was to dig out the potholes in such a way that any berms or the trail system, which kind of cuts through here as kind of a berm, would be sufficient. So you wouldn't have a trail that's way too high because he dug out way too much dirt, but you wouldn't have a trail that's way too low because he didn't dig enough dirt out. So he tried to work all those calculations, and it turned out to be a little bit tough, but he did a really good job of that. So one of the first things we did was we put up signage. Here's a key point, and we did this at UST too, by the way. Before you start any prairie project, especially in the city, do not go out and kill grass and then try to explain to your neighbors why you did that. Don't wait till people are mad at you. Don't do it. I'm just telling you. So the first thing we did at UST, because we were preparing for this thing on Saturdays, we said, you need to, before you kill any blade of grass, you need a sign here that says that this grass is about to die, but it's dying for a good reason. Okay? It's going to die a noble death. Okay? So we did. And I actually had a sign that actually was a lot more playful that got shot down. It was new homes coming soon. And it was all about the animals, and we had a couple of folks that were not excited about that. What do you mean you're coming soon? It's like, we can have fun. We're environmentalists, but we don't have to be sticking the muds. All right. So we got to work. So one of the things that we wanted to do was we wanted to document this process. So we hired a guy to do a time-lapse videography of the first couple of years. And he did it from different angles, and we're piecing together a video right now. But this is the guys coming in. They're putting in the trail system. And boy, I wish they worked that fast. That is heavy equipment digging out potholes. And they took about a month and a half to dig those out. But you can see, I mean, this was heavy equipment. There was nothing but bare dirt there, okay? So when heavy equipment comes in, guess what comes in with them? Weed seeds, okay? So we knew that was going to happen. We couldn't hose off the equipment every day. But they're building the trail, also disturbing the soil in different ways. So one of the things about this process is it's highly, highly invasive. I mean, very invasive. You're not touching the land, you're shaping the land, you're terraforming, right? But we needed to get that understructure right. So the good news is as we try to lock up more and more land in the Houston area as prairie, there are literally tens of thousands, if not a couple 100,000 acres of unland-leveled land around here that if we could just kill the Chinese tallow and get the bad plants off, the superstructure is already there. Because this, dirt moving and engineering it, that's the really super expensive part of this project, okay? By comparison, the seeds, the seed hay, the fire, the herbicide, all the stuff that we used was a lot cheaper than that. That earth moving and engineering was very expensive. So what we want to do is work on this old assumption. You rebuild the plant community, you rebuild the animal community, right? So what to plant? Good question. And how do we maximize the number of species? So if you guys are familiar with what they're doing up in the Midwest, there's a guy that we're working with named Stephen Apfel, an amazing ecologist from up in Wisconsin. He runs a private company, and his private company has a nursery that they use material from his nursery to do. He's growing 650 species. Light years ahead of where we are. So what we had to do is think, how can we maximize the number of species, but also how can we win a foot race? You see, doing prairie restorations is a little bit like voodoo, right? There is a lot of craftsmanship, a lot of luck that's needed, and sometimes it still doesn't go right. We ran into some problems, and I'll tell you about those. But one thing that will kill you every time is if you don't win the foot race with the invasive grasses, or flowers in some cases, it will choke out your restoration. So one of the things that we decided very early on was that we would use a hybrid technique. We would try to use as many wild type species as we could. So if we could collect it from a 60-mile radius or 70-mile radius, that is the platinum version of doing restoration. Unfortunately, we couldn't do that for that 53-acre site very easily. So we did buy seeds. And when you buy seeds, there are really three different options. You can buy seed that is wild harvested, so Native American seed. We did buy some wild harvested seed from the U of H Coastal Center, that Native American seed harvested, collected, and cleaned. That's great. We had people grow things for the Great Grow Out from wild collected seed on seed collecting trips. We grew some stuff out in the nursery from seeds we collected on the Katy Prairie. But then we made a decision which is not universally accepted, and I understand that, and that is we used 4 species of NRCS-derived seeds. This is what this means. We used seeds that were originally collected outside of our region and were grown for very specific reasons, under very specific conditions, by the Natural Resources Conservation Service. So, how many of you guys have heard of Alamo switchgrass? A few of you guys. It's a monster, right? You don't want to plant it. It goes nuts. Because it was bred to be very, very aggressive, okay? The 4 species that we selected are not hyper-aggressive in this region because we've used it on a number of projects. But it does violate that rule that you should principally get your seeds from a 50 or 60 mile radius. The reason we made that exception was we have such an incredible invasive species load on the Katy Prairie that we were afraid that if we didn't use some of those seeds, which break dormancy super quick, germinate super quick in relation to the wild type seeds, and hold the structure while the slower stuff comes through, we would lose the foot race and have to start over again. And every time you start over again, you have to use herbicide. So one of the chief concerns that we had is we wanted to use as little herbicide as possible. So we substituted into the mixture some NRCS quick germinating. Now they're the same species, a little bit different genetics. Now what I will tell you about it from my experience in using on 3 projects now is those 4 tend to really start to decline and blink out after about year 3. So it doesn't look like they're becoming monsters, it looks like they're not persistent, which is exactly what you want them to do. And I'm not saying that's a miracle cure. That's why we're the only group in town that is paying somebody to literally go out, collect seeds, and send them to seed companies so we can have our own locally adapted seed. And we're actually starting to get some of that back. Native American Seed now is producing purple lovegrass collected right here from this region. Soon they're going to be producing Texas coneflower collected right here from this region. You can thank Lan Shen for being the seed collector on those projects. So until we get to that point where we have a better seed selection, we're going to have to make some exceptions real quick. But here's one thing that we could not anticipate. You guys were all here for this, I think, unless you were on vacation. This is our time-lapse video. This is the tax day flood. During the tax day flood, this is what our property started to look like very, very quickly. It didn't, oh, that's night. That's night, sorry. It's still going. But when the sun came up, this is what it looked like. Okay? So it moved half our gravel trail off in places. The water got up to 5 feet on our property. I could have taken an airboat 10 miles across the prairie. So when folks tell you that the Katy Prairie doesn't store water, don't believe that. All this water could have been in the city. Millions of gallons of water. But here's my point. Does this complicate things? You bet. Because we dug those potholes originally in April of 2014. That winter, we were going to plant our first prairie seeds. Guess what? Super wet. The whole thing was wet. Couldn't get the tractor out there without getting it stuck. The next year, we're going to get in there in the spring and plant those seeds. Memorial Day flood. The next year, we're going to come back out there and do something in April, the tax day flood. So, even though we started the project in 2014, we didn't really get those seeds down until last fall. So, the wetlands were doing great. They loved it. And they were repopulating like crazy. We didn't actually move any plant material into the wetlands, and they looked great. But the uplands were a challenge, because not only did this inundate and couldn't let us get in there, but it also brought in a lot of seeds that we didn't like either. But we did go out and we said, you know what, we're going to go to some of the platinum prairies, the best prairies in the region, and we're going to get as much of their genetics infused in this prairie as much as possible. So we went out to there's a UAH Coastal Center. That's our friends at Native American Seed. They're up there on the combine, and I got to ride in the cabin, which was fun. And I said, look, that patch over there, I want some of that patch. Super heavy in rattlesnake master and liatris. I said, you know, George, go over there. And he's going over there, and he said, you know, I'm going to get this whole thing anyway, right? I said, okay, I know, but it feels like I'm an artisan. I'm like picking and choosing. And he goes, yeah, we're going to get the whole thing. So anyway, we got some of this in our seed mix. Then I said, Bamert Seed was those NRCS releases, and that is a wonderful guy named Gary Stevens who is running a no-till drill. That was last fall. And so once we got the conditions to where we wanted them, then we didn't want to disturb the soil anymore and bring any more weed seeds, so they used that no-till drill. Before he used that no-till drill, though, we did a couple things. We burned it, and we mowed it in some places where we couldn't burn it. And because we wanted as much soil contact as possible, and we wanted that seed drill to get through there. Plus, there were big clumps of clay and other things left over, and so they had to bring a tractor with a grater on it and kind of smooth out some spots, and we had to treat for some Bermuda grass that had come back and things like that. But then we said, you know what? We want more genetics. So we contracted with a seed cutter down in Brazoria County. They went out to the incredible Nash Prairie that's owned by the Nature Conservancy of Texas. They cut us 47 bales of hay. Each one of those hay bales is about that big. And this was not cheap, by the way. You'd think hay is cheap, right? But for the cost of buying those 47 bales and transporting them over 50 miles was about $9,000. So it's not cheap, but we hope it's worth it. There's actually things sprouting out of that hay right now. And do we know what we got? No, that's part of the fun. It's like a box of chocolates, right? We don't know, but because Nash is so amazing, and because our invasive species load is so high already, it's not likely that we're going to get an invasive that we don't have. It's possible, but it's not likely. But it's very possible on the flip side to get species that we don't have otherwise come in on this beautiful hay. And that's when the fun began. We got Sierra Club and a whole bunch of folks that come out. And I tell you what, we should sell this as a workout. This is an amazing workout. When you do this, and then you spread the hay by hand across the prairie, it's a labor of love. I'll just tell you that. And like I said, I think that it's reaping benefits in terms of some of the soil microbes that it brought in and some of the seeds that it brought in. And I filmed them for a while. It took a long time for them to get that hay out there. So we use fire and herbicide and earth moving to prepare the bed. We got seeds from the wild. We got seeds from people growing them out at home. We had these planting events. We have our big planting event in the fall called Putting Down Roots, double entendre on purpose. And so what we've done is we've used a combinational method that a lot of folks use, which is throw everything in the kitchen sink at it, see how it responds, and make adjustments. Ecological restoration is just like teaching. You try something, something fails, you change. So Jim Willis, who's just a really exceptionally gifted restorationist, says fail fast, fix fast. That's exactly right. You got to fail to learn, and once you learn, you change what you're doing, right? So one of the things that you guys can do if you're not familiar, I'm sure Lan has banged you over the head about the Great Grow Out, but we did use quite a few plants that were grown at gardens and civic clubs and at private homes. We took them out to the field office, grew them up, Alan Breimer grew them up, and we planted them. And some people actually did the full cycle. So Wally Ward, your president, these aren't his plants, but he grows the most beautiful rattlesnake masters. And I can literally go to patches of his rattlesnake masters that we planted at Shrike Prairie up on Warren Lake, and they're still very much alive and growing. So you can have kind of a... So you don't need to hear the audio on this, but this is our native seed nursery. It's not a big going affair, but it's kind of a fun place to learn some techniques of growing things. And what we're doing is, Alan, since he's taken over, he's really done a good job of experimenting with seeds. We just want to try whatever we can try to grow diverse stocks. So if it's super common and it's going to be in the seed mix anyway, we don't try to grow it because it's going to be there. So we want to get the stuff that's not in the seed mix. So we're trying some sunflowers, like ashy sunflower, and some things that aren't in the mix. Sometimes Lan will go out on a seed collecting trip, which you guys can accompany her on throughout the year. And she gets some really weird stuff, and she gets it to us and say, usually the conversation goes like this in my office. Hey, do you want this? Sure. Okay, well, take it to Alan. Yeah, take it down. And he grows it out, and here's Wally. He's working in the nursery. And you got the CNN scroll at the bottom, just because I couldn't help it. And then the fun part begins, or the scary part. And that is, did it work? You spent $600,000. Did it do anything? And it's really scary. I will tell you, it's really scary. Now in the city, when we do this, it's got to work the first time. It cannot work the second time. I'll just tell you that right now. I was sweating bullets when we did the MD Anderson Prairie, because literally, the chief executive officer was overlooking the prairie from his office, literally. And so it had to work the first time, so we had to really work it, right? But even in a place like this, where so many donors have been so generous to give you money, it had better work after a fairly short duration of time. And you can't force nature, but you can tilt the balance in your own way. So you got to monitor what's going on. So here's the cool thing. There's both anecdotal stuff, and then there's some listing stuff that we're doing. Anecdotally, what happened, which was amazing, was we dug the potholes in April of 2014. This was blooming in May of 2014 in the potholes. What happened was some of that seed bank in some of these old ancestral potholes started to come up and bloom or germinate or do things. So this is called blue mud plantain, and I guess it's got a super fast life cycle. I don't know. I never knew it would come up that quickly and start blooming. And you started to see all these native sedges and rushes and things just popping up all over the place. Really kind of amazing. And now those potholes look really great. This happened the first summer. Those potholes, it was just bare, it looked like the surface of Mars. Somebody had sprinkled water on it because it was kind of red dirt a little bit, and there was these water puddles. There were these avocets, blackneck stilts were breeding in those potholes the first year. I could not believe it. The first summer, months after we dug them out, we were finding frogs, we were finding crawfish. Goodness knows how they got there. It's just an explosion of life. And this is part of what I guess what I'm getting at here, is if you have a chance to mix grassland and wetland, the biodiversity is going to be way higher than if it's just a grassland. So if you have a little pocket prairie at home, put some water feature next to it. It really increases the value for wildlife. This is a stunner. So this is not my picture, by the way. I'm not going to take credit for that. I should have credited the author. But this is a spectacular frog. This is called the crawfish frog. And this is a frog that is in steep decline. It's being considered for listing as a threatened or endangered species. We had no idea that this species was there until we dug these potholes. And then I got a call last year, actually at the end of 2015, and we started to hear all these frogs and people were reporting things. And then it rolled into 2016 and people were hearing more different kinds of frogs. And then I got this recording of this frog. And I said, what in the world, really? And then there were a bunch of them. So, you know, you can't tell nature to do anything, you can't push her to do anything, but you can change the conditions enough so that you can allow her to express herself in different ways. And this was a stunning bit of thing. Now, as this project evolves, different things are going on. So we noticed in the second year, just in year 2, that bald eagles were hunting those potholes for ducks. And then things started to really pick up. In the summertime, we started to get wood storks and roseate spoonbills. And then we started to see all kinds of different kinds of grasshoppers using the upland part of the prairie, even though it wasn't fully restored or anything. And I think it's because that dynamic mix of the upland and the lowland. And then this happened. I've been at the Conservancy for 11 years. One of the things that I've done every year since I've been there is I teach a class called Summer Science Nights, a series in the summer. We teach from like 6 to 8 because it's too hot in the day and we don't have any shade. I had never seen a firefly on this property, not one in 10 years. Camped out 2 weeks ago with my son, his first camp out. He's only like 2.5 years old. And there was an entire field of fireflies. All up and down Airbear Road, and especially around that property. It gave me the chills because it was just so magical that you had pushed it a little ways and then nature started to fill in the gaps. Michael? No, but we think there were 2 species. We don't know if there were 2 species because there were definitely different flashes. So if you know anything about fireflies, I don't, but one was extraordinarily long and one was much shorter bursts. So I'm going to go out there and try to do some filming and see if that'll help us at all. But long story short, you start making these changes, things start to happen. Same thing in the city. We planted that MD Anderson prairie, and we have found some really weird bees and things in there. And the first year after it was planted, we found 11 species of crickets, grasshoppers, and katydids. Where did they come from? We don't know. So one of the things that we're doing this summer with U of H is we're hiring an intern, a university student or just graduated university student, to measure how all these pocket prairies in the city are functioning for pollinators. And they're going to write it up as a paper. Because we need to know that kind of stuff. We need the scientific background. We need to document things. And we're using iNaturalist. So I showed you guys that iNaturalist and the tons of blips and blops, right? So one thing is we've been really fortunate to have Andy Newman go out and other people go out on the Indiangrass Preserve, and we're starting to catalog all the life on that preserve. And there's just tons and tons of dots, okay? So we went from this, that is in 1995, when it was still being used as an ag research station, to this, which is in, I think this is 2012, to this, once we started to conceive of the project, to dirt being moved like that, and then hopefully this will work. It was kind of hinky. This is what it looks like today. What you see is a really complicated ecosystem in the making. So this is actually a little bit of a drone flight. It's a little hinky. But long story short, reconstruction of these prairie ecosystems is really great. Now, does this mean that we don't have any problem issues out here? Of course not. We have some invasive grasses coming back, but boy, do we have a lot of really great stuff coming in, especially with these wetlands. And some of the upland areas are looking really, really good. So I anticipate, if all goes well, and we can keep the invasive species load down and let those natives come on, that in a couple, 3 years, it'll really look like a prairie. And in some ways, it's already functioning like an old prairie. So with that, I'll try not to blind myself and finish up real quick and then get you guys some questions. So how you restore the human connectivity. So one thing that we're doing is we're trying to find new ways of using this place because it's important. We're bringing out high school students from the 5th Ward once a month. They're doing restoration work, both in the upland prairies, in the nursery, and in other places. But we're also able to do so much more with this property than we ever were. So that's my godson, one of my 3 godsons on the right over here, Caleb, and he's obsessed with frogs. So we had a pothole croakers night where we went out with herpetologists and we went out and caught frogs and measured them and swabbed them for diseases and all that stuff. And he got to meet a bullfrog that night. And he has not stopped talking about that since. Okay? And now when we do summer science nights, we had the full array of stuff. We're just building a wildlife viewing platform, or a pond dipping platform right now. And the plan calls, we're in the final stages finally of getting a plan for a visitor center. A real visitor center that will allow for some overnight visitation as well. So, long story short, there's a lot happening, not just to the biology, but to the human spirit out there. So there's room for questions. All right.